Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday, the 25th of August. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 183 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I'll introduce this evening's guest, and then together we will look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant has been disconnected from Ukraine's national grid for the first time in nearly 40 years of operation, the country's nuclear power operator, Energoatom, has said. The final power line connecting the plant to the grid was cut twice by fires at the ash pits of a nearby coal-fired power plant. 3 other lines had already been taken out by months of fighting. Disconnecting the plant raises the risk of catastrophic failure of cooling systems for its reactors and spent fuel rods, which run on electricity. If you'd like to know more about the plant at Zaporizhia, then watch last night's Scotland at 7, during which Dr. Alan Flowers gives us a lot more information and background. At least 22 people have been killed and 50 wounded in a Russian rocket strike on a Ukrainian railway station, as the country marked a somber Independence Day, and 6 months since Moscow's invasion started. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said the rocket struck a train in a station in the town of Chaplin, about 90 miles west of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. Chaplin is in our pain today. As of this moment, there are 22 dead, 5 of them burned in a car. An 11-year-old teenager died, he said, adding that the death toll could increase as rescue operations continue. Zelensky says Russia has placed the world on the brink of a radiation disaster. It is a fact that the Russian military made the territory of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe a combat zone. Now all of Europe and all neighbouring regions are under the threat of radiation pollution, he said in a Wednesday evening address. Zelensky also called for the UN's nuclear watchdog to take permanent control of the situation at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Moscow is making preparations to stage referendums in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, according to US intelligence. We have information that Russia continues to prepare to hold these sham referendum in Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, a spokesperson for Biden's National Security Council, John Kirby, has said. Plans by Russian-backed authorities to try Ukrainian prisoners of war in Mariupol would be a mockery of justice, the US Secretary of State spokesperson Ned Price has said. The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has claimed that the slowing pace of its military campaign in Ukraine is deliberate and driven by the need to reduce civilian casualties. And the UK is importing no energy from Russia for the first time on record. Figures from the Office for National Statistics, released 6 months after the start of the war, found that in June the UK's imports from Russia were down by 97% and stood at only £33 million as sanctions took effect. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by a regular friend to Scotland at 7. William Duguid is an activist, commentator and blogger, and he also helps to run the Perth and Kinross Yes Hub. William, good evening. How are you keeping?
I'm in reasonable shape, but nice to be here again.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, William, and we're very grateful to you for joining us this evening on Scotland at 7. Our first story this evening is that the Deputy First Minister is meeting with COSLA and trade unions this afternoon in an effort to broker a deal which would bring the Cleansing Department strikes in Edinburgh and 13 other councils to an end. The Scottish Government has already provided an additional £140 million towards finding a pay settlement for council employees across Scotland. On Friday, COSLA offered a 5% pay increase. However, the unions felt unable to accept the offer without further clarification of how the deal would be structured to increase the wages of the lowest paid workers. Mr Swinney left the talks earlier this evening at around 5 p.m, leaving council leaders and union representatives to continue their negotiations. So, William, the union Unison said in a statement earlier today that the trade unions had constructive talks with John Swinney last night, where it was agreed that both the Scottish Government and COSLA have a role to play in resolving the dispute. However, They continued that there has still been no significant breakthrough, and the key issue remains the same. The funding envelope, as the council put it, on the table is not enough, and they say that we need to construct a pay deal which is fair to everyone. So is it simply, and I say simply, but I know it's not simply, but is it simply a matter of more money on the table being required in order to make progress towards a resolution of this industrial action?
It's very difficult to ensure a resolution when inflation shows every sign of running away. Um, will there ever be enough money on the table to even be even close to keeping pace with inflation? So I think it's quite encouraging language that's coming from Unison. The idea that the talks were constructive. I mean, at least there are talks, which isn't always happening with various unions in England, and the idea that it's possible that maybe a restructuring of the money that is on the table may be sufficient to get us over the hump. But at the end of the day, I think a little extra money wouldn't go amiss. And here we run into the problem that necessarily the amount of money that's available to the Scottish Government to throw at this is limited. One always gets the impression that they're doing what they can, but at the end of the day, the UK has been beset by systematic underfunding of the public sector for quite some time, and there's no immediate sign of that changing. So interesting, but there's more trouble to come as well, and that is also something to throw into the mix in terms of what money is available. There are other unions now looking at taking strike action, and one can't help but think that perhaps a general strike of some sort within the UK may not be too far away.
Well, that's an interesting point, William. I was going to ask you. I was reflecting this afternoon that it's only my impression, but my impression is that the level and the spread of industrial action, both planned and underway, seems to be significantly lower in Scotland than in England at the moment. I'm thinking, for example, the criminal advocates, barristers in England are now on permanent strike, for example, which is despite concerns about the levels of legal aid in Scotland. We've not seen industrial action from the bar or from solicitors in Scotland. So is it fair to say that there is at the moment a difference in the amount of industrial action? If there is, why might that be? Or if there is, and even if there is, to your point, do you think it's more likely that we will start to see more coordinated industrial action across the UK, which may move towards a general strike?
Could happen that way. I think that it's as much a question of timing within Scotland as anything else. Obviously, the English legal aid system has been a mess for quite some time. And so you've got the possibility of the courts getting totally snarled up, which actually is a fairly fundamental issue for England. We in Scotland, of course, right now happen to have something that's very attractive to the broadcasters to show piles of rubbish. They loved it at COP26, and now they've got it at the Edinburgh Festival. And so the politicians can line up in the grass market with their placards and say, the Scottish Government must do something. So it has hitherto, we got our real issues as far as they affected us over with earlier in the summer. But now, of course, we're affected also by the dispute with Network Rail. And we've got things like not just the bin staff starting strikes in other parts of Scotland, including Perth and Kinross in a few days' time, but we're looking at nursery schools closing, we're looking at janitors and catering staff, and I think the latest is the teachers expressing dissatisfaction. Now, a lot of that could be sabre rattling, but a lot of it also speaks to the genuine financial difficulties in which many people at really surprising levels are now beset with, because the economy is in trouble and private individuals are in trouble. So I think we will see more of it, and it looks as if it may have to come to a head in order to have any sort of resolution.
Absolutely. Thank you, William. I'm bound to say I walked through Edinburgh, the Old Town and the New Town earlier today, and whilst it is grotty and it's clear that the bins are not being emptied I grew up in Edinburgh in the 1980s when the Labour Party was also in control, and I don't think it looks much worse than I remember it during the 1980s. But enough of my reflections on this. Let's look at our next story, because you mentioned resolution of the industrial action and the threats of industrial action, and helpfully, a new Resolution Foundation report titled A Chilling Crisis was published today and is calling for the new Prime Minister to introduce a radical new policy support, such as energy bill freezes and solidarity taxes, or unprecedented social tariffs costing tens of billions of pounds to prevent the deepening energy bills crisis becoming a serious threat to families' physical and financial health this winter. The report examines the impact of rising energy bills on low, middle and high income households this winter, with the price cap now forecast to hit £3,600 in October and top £4,500 in January, and also the policy responses that are required. The report notes that typical energy bills were cost around £2,000 more this year than last year, money that many families simply don't have. This income shock will be most acute this winter when close to 80% of all annual domestic gas demand occurs, and among low-income households who will spend twice as much of their family budgets on energy bills as high-income families. The UK's 4 million customers on prepayment meters face the toughest conditions, as they can't spread their energy costs and could face bills of £613 in January alone. Even after the £67 energy bill rebate, this is equivalent to a totally unaffordable 44% of their typical monthly disposable income. While £30 billion has already been committed to supporting families with energy bills, the Resolution Foundation warns that a far higher price cap coming in ahead of peak energy use means that we are on course for a winter catastrophe, with the cost of energy £881 higher than was forecast back in May. Thousands could see their power cut off and their health endangered, while millions could fall behind on bills, run up arrears and damage their credit ratings. Already, the number of families who are falling behind on at least one utility bill has increased from 9 to 14% between October 2021 and June 2022. The report argues that significant fresh support must take account of who is least able to cope with rising bills, namely low and middle income families, and recognises that surging prices will increase bills by more for some than for others, including larger families and those in energy inefficient homes. Responding to the report, the SNP has criticised the UK government for being missing in action over the cost of living crisis. The SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis MP said, while households grapple with the cost of living crisis that is spiralling rapidly out of control, the Tory government is missing in action, too consumed by its own internal chaos to get on with the day job of protecting households. These latest warnings of a looming catastrophe and millions of families being left out in the cold due to unmanageable bills must serve as a wake-up call for the UK government to act before more people are pushed over the brink. So, William, firstly, at the end of May, Kate Forbes, our Finance Secretary, wrote to the Chancellor of the Westminster Exchequer and said, use the £30 billion of fiscal headroom you have against your current fiscal rules, along with any additional proceeds from a windfall tax, to deliver a timely and targeted fiscal support package. This would provide ample support to provide ample space to support a significant fiscal response to the cost of living crisis. And she went on, in the midst of such a crisis, it would be unconscionable to hold this funding in reserve to fund tax cuts in future years. So, William, do you think, is there any chance that the Westminster Chancellor, whoever he or she is this week, will heed Kate Forbes' letter? And if not, why not?
Well, I'm sure Kate Forbes' letter was read at the time and put in an appropriate file. I won't speculate on where that file was. There has been a denial of reality by Westminster politicians about this whole thing. This is a far bigger problem even than household incomes. In fact, I suspect that if you just help households and don't, for example, help businesses, 30 billion won't even touch the sides. There is the risk that a lot of money will be spent, and rightly so, on protecting households, while at the same time, businesses are left to grapple with the energy increase on their own. And they don't have a cap. And I suspect a lot of businesses, particularly in sectors such as hospitality, which use a lot of energy, will go to the wall. Um, this whole thing affects not just people's physical and financial health, but also their mental health. And when you bear in mind that they've already been through 2 pretty hellish years with the pandemic, I think we're really hitting breaking point. I think a much more comprehensive package of aid is required. The Resolution Foundation report is the latest to appear, and I think has a lot of good ideas, particularly in terms of protecting those who are the poorest from the biggest effects, and pointing out that some of the other solutions, particularly from the political parties, tend to actually favour the rich yet again. So that's good. There have been others such as Richard Murphy, and that has a far bigger amount involved. So it's a complicated business.
It is. But as you say, a much more comprehensive package is really required in order to address the breadth and the depth of the challenges that it seems pretty clear we are all about to face, be we domestic customers or small businesses or others. But let's look a little bit more closely at the issues facing small businesses with our next item, because small businesses across the UK have told of sleepless nights and fears that they will not survive the winter due to looming increases in their energy bills. Firms have experienced a 424% rise in gas costs and a 349% increase in electricity prices since February 2021, according to data from the Federation of Small Businesses. Thousands of traders are looking to renegotiate electricity and gas contracts that expire in October, as 2-year fixed-price supply deals come to an end. Companies do not have a cap on their energy bills, unlike domestic consumers, who will learn the next Ofgem price cap rate next Friday, leaving the businesses at the mercy of spiralling wholesale gas markets. Major energy firms are refusing to supply small businesses out of concern that they could go bust, while some are demanding £10,000 deposits up front. In the latest sign of the deepening energy crisis, business owners said they were struggling to find suppliers in the run-up to the busy October period for renewing gas and electricity contracts, leaving them facing extortionate bills or demands for a deposit. Suppliers named as having refused service or asking for deposits include SSE, Scottish Power, E.ON, Next, Drax and Ecotricity. Business owners called for urgent action from the UK government, warning that sectors such as hospitality, which are already struggling with inflation and the lingering effects of the pandemic, are at particular risk. Unlike households, businesses typically buy energy in contracts that last several years, often via a specialist broker that connects them with suppliers for a quote. If they cannot find a fixed rate contract, they move on to an out-of-contract deemed rate, which is uncapped and can soar in line with market prices. So, William, firstly, is that before we look at small businesses in more detail, is this simply more evidence that the energy market in the UK is utterly and completely broken?
Yes, it is. It's broken and it's in a chaotic state. And we're starting to see some of the examples of what happens when a system is in a chaotic state. Um, you know, energy firms being unwilling to supply small businesses because they think they'll go bust. So already kneecapping them when they're already in a fairly dire state anyway.
Absolutely. Now, in terms of one small business, for example, Teresa Hodgson, who's the landlady of a pub near Uxbridge, the Prime Minister's constituency, was initially told by her supplier, SSE, that it could not give her a quote for energy because prices were going up so fast. She says that when she asked why, they said, "We don't think that a lot of pubs are going to make it this year, and we need security." Is SSE spelling out some very hard truths which the Westminster government is ignoring or hiding from?
I think they are. I think if nothing is done, the hospitality sector will be in dire straits. And already there are cutbacks going on, and you can see them on the high street now. Um, this sounds like a really first world problem, but I tried to, after the Perth Hustings demo last Tuesday, get a meal at 8 o'clock in Perth, only to find the first two places I tried, the kitchen was already closed because it wasn't worth the while staying open later. Um, and this will be repeated and amplified as the crisis goes on. The figures that are being cited for energy costs are absurd. I know it's market forces, but the market is behaving absurdly, and it requires a very creative response, and it requires assurances from government that people will be looked after and businesses will be looked after, and for that matter, the public sector will be looked after, because that's another thing. Nothing is unconnected to this crisis. It just reaches everywhere.
That's a very good point that you make, William. Libraries, schools, hospitals, pretty much any building in Scotland relies on heating. And so the impact of this is certainly going to hit small businesses, but it's got impacts all across the board for us all. And that is really why, as you say, a much larger and more comprehensive response is required from government and required quickly. But let's look at another aspect of the energy crisis from us as it occurs in Scotland, because the North Sea's biggest oil and gas producer has become the latest big energy company to report huge earnings on the back of rising wholesale prices, with half-year profits rising 12-fold to £1.3 billion. Harbour Energy said it would hand an extra $200 million to shareholders on the back of bumper revenues, which were boosted by the jump in fossil fuel prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as well as extra income linked with its merger and reverse takeover with Premier Oil. Its surging earnings and investor payouts will add to the debate in the UK about whether to increase the windfall tax on oil and gas producers, following outrage at the world's 5 biggest oil companies' eye-watering profits of nearly £50 billion between April and June. Meanwhile, households in Britain await the announcement on Friday of a new domestic energy price cap. It is forecast to increase to nearly £3,600 a year from October, while rising gas and electricity bills are forcing businesses across the UK to fold. Harbour Energy said it is now preparing to pay another $100 million in dividends to shareholders by October, and to increase its share buyback programme from £200 million to £300 million. Now, a little bit of background here. Harbour Energy was a business that I hadn't heard a great deal of, William. It was born during a time of turmoil for the oil industry. In 2020, as governments implemented lockdowns and travel restrictions, demand for fuel plummeted and oil prices went through the floor. Brent crude was below $20 a barrel in April 2020. This dealt a huge blow to players such as Premier Oil, the company, which is a mid-tier producer of hydrocarbons focusing on the UK and Southeast Asia, reported a $671 million loss for only the first half of 2020, and its shares were at 26p, having been £1 at the start of 2020. Now, Premier was rescued in a reverse takeover and has become Harbour Energy, and now it's looking at half-year profits rising 12-fold to £1.3 billion. So is this the oil business returning to where it started, a kind of Wild West, unregulated boom and bust cycle with huge risks over the life of that cycle and huge impacts on consumers?
Like it, doesn't it? It's very Wild Westy. Or I'm thinking in terms of, whoa, finally, after some difficult times, Harbour Energy won the lottery. And it does suggest that, to a great extent, the capitalist model is broken. And I don't know exactly how you fix that, but I think everywhere in the world we need to be looking at how we financially get through the great changes that need to be made. Because, of course, this whole sector is not long for this world, or this world may not belong for it, more to the point where it may not belong for us unless we do something about it. So I think we're just seeing again the symptoms of a general malaise about the economy and the economies of the world generally. And this sort of lottery win for the shareholders, safe harbour for them in the financial crisis, is just one aspect of it.
That's a very good point that you make, William. The ability of the current neoliberal or capitalist systems to withstand the shocks of COVID and then war in Europe, war between Russia and Ukraine, it certainly appears to be straining that system to breaking point. There was one other aspect to this I was going to ask you briefly about, looking at trying to look at this from the opposite perspective. In that sense, is this story actually in some sense is a good news story? Harbour Energy is a company that's registered in Scotland and has its headquarters here, and it pays tax in Scotland. So is there any good news in this story at all for Scotland?
Well, maybe if it's had more of a windfall, it should pay slightly more taxes. I think maybe it does benefit from a rather beneficial tax regime right now anyway. So I'm really glad it's Scottish and all that, but I don't think I'm wanting to apply different rules to Scottish companies to any other company.
Absolutely. Thank you, William. Let's look at the energy crisis from another perspective now, because The Guardian is reporting that solar farms are being refused planning permission in the UK at the highest rate in 5 years. Their analysis has found that projects which could have cut £100 million off annual electricity bills have been turned down in the past 18 months. Planning permission for 23 solar farms was refused across England, Wales and Scotland between January 21 and July 2022, which could have produced enough renewable energy to power an estimated 147,000 homes annually, according to analysis of government figures by the planning and development consultancy Turley. The refusals have jumped significantly since the start of 2021. The research found only 4 projects were refused planning permission between 2017 and 2020 combined. There are fears that such refusals could increase further as the Tory leadership contenders Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak have both made disparaging remarks about solar farms. South West and Eastern England had the highest number of refusals in the last 18 months, with 4 projects turned down in each region. Wales, the West Midlands and Scotland each had 3 refusals, and the East Midlands, North East and South East of England each had 2. Analysts at the think tank Green Alliance said that rejected projects were large solar farms at an average of about 30 megawatts each, which may account for the planning refusals, as it is easier to get smaller farms approved. However, it added that this should not be a reason to refuse planning permission, as larger solar farms can cut bills further. It said the refused solar farms could have cut about £100 million off Great Britain's electricity bills this year. And in Angus, a planning application for a almost 50 megawatt solar farm at Berryhill Farm, near the village of Fowlis, was rejected in February, following 136 objections to the project. The application is now under consideration by the Scottish Government's Planning and Appeals Division. So, William, firstly, the politics of this. The order here is curious. Is this story a reflection or in some way connected to, in particular, Liz Truss's calls for solar to be stopped? On this subject, she said, "Our fields should be filled of our fantastic produce, whether it's great livestock, great arable farms. It shouldn't be full of solar panels, and I will change the rules. I will change the rules to make sure that we make sure that we are using our high-value agricultural land for farming." So, is this solar farm story? Is it just a distraction during the interminable Tory car crash of the Titans, or is this actual Westminster policy being made here?
Difficult to be sure. When Liz Truss says something, she might say something further down the line. I think the refusals were well underway by the time she made the remarks about how nice it would be to have more agricultural land. The other thing that we don't know for sure is how many applications for solar farms are being accepted, and are smaller ones by and large getting through, because it would be nice to see a greater spread of solar, just in terms of diversity of renewables. I fear, though, that the Tory thinking about energy, once they've squeezed the last drop of oil out and puffed a bit more of it up into the atmosphere, is to go hell for leather for nuclear, which happens, at least until the price of oil went so radically up, to be one of the more expensive forms. And I suspect also maybe one of the areas in which maybe some of their chums might be able to make more money from. The real answer lies in Scotland and its potential for a wide range of renewables, including, amazingly, solar, given the weather we tend to have, but certainly wind farms and all sorts of other things. And I really would love to see that go forward in an independent Scotland.
Thank you, William. As you say, surely a mix of renewables is the answer to the energy crisis and to the climate crisis as well going forwards. But the energy crisis is having a number of knock-on effects, and we'll look at that with our next item, because the UK government has urged CO2 producers to do everything they can to meet food and drink industry demand after one of the UK's largest suppliers confirmed it was going to pause production at a key facility. CF Industries, the private US company that accounts for 60% of the UK's CO2 supplies, said that soaring energy prices meant it would temporarily halt production at its remaining UK ammonia plant, which creates CO2 as a byproduct. The plant in Billingham Teesside is essential to industries ranging from beer to meat to fizzy drinks. CF Industries said that the shutdown was the result of tough market conditions, noting that current prices for natural gas used in the process were uneconomical after rising to twice the level they were a year ago. It expects prices to continue rising in the months ahead. Meat processors, brewers, bakers, farmers and soft drink producers all use CO2 in producing their goods and packaging them in inert gas to keep them fresh. It is also required for stunning before the slaughter of animals, including pigs and chickens, and is used in hospitals and nuclear power plants. The UK last suffered a crisis in CO2 last September, when high energy prices combined with annual maintenance shutdowns brought UK production to a near halt. The UK government funded a 3-week bailout for CF Industries to stave off supply chain chaos, before brokering an emergency deal with the supplier. The UK government is now urging the industry to do more to meet demand. Since last autumn, the CO2 market's resilience has improved, with additional imports, further production from existing domestic sources, and better stockpiles, a UK government spokesperson said. CF Industries said it had notified customers who buy CO2 about the impending temporary halt in production, but said that it had not yet settled on an exact date for the shutdown or how long it might last. So there's two things that strike me here, William, about this story. We had a CO2 shortage a couple of summers ago, last September. And one might have thought that some actual action might have been taken to strengthen the supply chain, and the government has insisted that the CO2 market's resilience has improved. Now, with CF Industries saying it's about to shut down 60% of the UK production of CO2, that's simply not true, is it?
It doesn't seem to be true, does it? There may be a bit of saber rattling from CF Industries. Maybe they're looking for another bailout. That's a possibility. But again, here we are in the chaos that's been introduced by the rise in energy prices with no end in sight. So it certainly doesn't need a short-term solution. And the resilience needs to be improved on a permanent basis, because clearly it's not very resilient, and the government can put out the bland rhetoric all it likes. I would just add it into the big picture. I do hope we have the politicians with the creativity to find a way out of this, because increasingly we will find other areas surprisingly affected. Already here we've got animal welfare, we've got hospitals, we've got food and drink, you name it. They're all beginning to get affected, and something needs to change.
Absolutely, William. And as you say, it's beginning to ripple out. And it struck me that with regard to this story might actually be said to be about the shutdown of production of fertilizer. The CF Industries plant in Billingham makes fertilizer, and CO2 is a byproduct of that process. Now, we know that as a result of the war in Ukraine, that the supply of fertilizer, both from Russia and from Ukraine, has largely stopped. If the UK's largest supplier of ammonia and fertilizer is also about to temporarily halt production, does that suggest that the next big impact will be in agriculture and in food production in the UK next year?
This trust will be very disappointed with that. Our agricultural land won't be getting used properly. Yeah, nothing would surprise me. It's perfectly possible. We have a systemic issue going on. And yeah, our own food production could be radically affected.
Thanks, William. Now then, we'll come back to Scotland to look at the energy crisis from another perspective, because immediate funding is being awarded to key energy advice organisations to make sure energy customers can access crucial support and advice to help to deal with rising energy bills and heating costs this winter. More than £1.2 million will be distributed to help key agencies, including Advice Direct Scotland, Home Energy Scotland, and Citizens Advice Scotland, to reach more people who desperately need help. The funding will also support a training programme for staff from third sector organisations to expand the reach of expert advice. The Scottish Government committed to provide additional support to advice agencies at the Scottish Energy Summit, hosted by the First Minister on Tuesday the 23rd of August, at which a series of further actions to mitigate the energy price rises were agreed with energy companies and advice organisations. The additional funding announced today is on top of the Scottish Government's existing investment in free income, welfare and debt advice services, including support to Money Advice Scotland and the Welfare Advice and Health Partnerships Programme. So, William, much of this funding, from what I can see, is to recruit and train staff into these advice services. That's got to be a good thing, isn't it?
Yes, that's got to be a good thing. They'll have their work cut out. If only we could stretch to a hologram of Martin Lewis in every sitting room.
That's a good point, William. I suspect with technology that may not be far away, although I'm not sure how much help a hologram or how much comfort a hologram of Martin Lewis will provide. But certainly a hologram of Martin Lewis in Downing Street might not be a bad thing, given the strength and the passion with which he has been speaking lately. But on the other side of this story, I very much doubt that these recruited and trained staff will be providing direct financial assistance to those caught up in this crisis. So, on the one hand, it's a good thing, but will this really make a difference?
No, I mean, the Scottish Government has, for now years, been getting very good at mitigation. And this is another part of the ever decreasing circle of mitigation that they're having to do. And the more it goes on, the more you think, well, let's get fundamental about this, because if we can have in our hands the means to make significant radical change, that's far better than all this stuff. This is good as far as it goes. But I suspect, again, it will not touch the sides. This is going to be such a big crisis. But well done, Scottish Government, again finding money and for a good cause. I'm not knocking it, but
Well,
there's a lot more to
that,
go.
that's a very good point, William. Finding money in the context of budgets that are fixed, so it is to be applauded and encouraged, and I'm sure we'll see more of it as the Scottish Government continues to seek, as you say, to mitigate the effects of policy decisions that are made or are not made in Westminster. But let's move away from the energy crisis now and look at another story, because The Guardian is reporting that the Home Office is planning a new deportation flight to Rwanda. Some newly arrived asylum seekers in hotels have now received letters from the department telling them their asylum claims are deemed inadmissible for consideration in the UK. The letters go on to say that the government intends to send them to Rwanda to have their claims processed there. Asylum seekers have 14 days to raise objections for their forced removal to the East African country. Claire Mosley, the founder of the charity Care for Calais, said, "We've recently learned that the Foreign Office warned Priti Patel that refugees should not be sent to Rwanda due to human rights concerns, including that they could be forced to join the country's army and sent to fight in neighbouring states. Against this backdrop, it hardly seems credible that the government is pressing ahead with this brutal plan. Once more, we will support terrified men and their distraught families as they face the devastating prospect of being forcibly deported halfway round the world. The latest notices of intent are being issued before a High Court hearing into the plan due to start on the 5th of September. It is expected to determine whether or not the policy to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda is even lawful. Claimants in the legal challenge include Care for Calais, its fellow charity Detention Action, and the PCS Civil Service Union, which represents many Home Office staff and several individual asylum seekers. The first planned flight to Rwanda on the 14th of June, you'll remember, was grounded after legal action. So, William, firstly, in terms of the politics of this, is this perhaps just a last spin of the wheel, a last hurrah for Priti Patel before she's replaced by Suella Braverman?
I'd forgotten that she was going to be replaced by Suella Braverman. Gosh, yes, it could be. Just get in a deportation before the court case. But it's just the attitude of this government in Westminster. It's a government that brazens things out, and even when it has its own officials saying we're really not happy about this, and it is to me very significant that the Civil Service Union is involved in the court case. But even getting that advice, they just double down. So, a last hurrah. I wish Priti Patel were going to be returning to the back benches, but we will see. Not an edifying thing to be happening, and I hope that those who are being thrown out of the country and sent off to Rwanda will, like the last lot, be able to find a way to resist it, because it's an inhumane, absurd, evil policy, and it has to stop.
All of those words sound pretty right to me, William. I noticed this afternoon that a Home Office spokesperson said, "Our world-leading partnership with Rwanda is a key part of our strategy to overhaul the broken asylum system and break the business model of evil people smuggling gangs." Now, it struck me they're not breaking the business model of people smugglers. They're muscling in. They're taking over. This is just a Sopranos-style shakedown where Westminster takes over another criminal enterprise, isn't it?
An additional sort of byproduct. The asylum seekers have already been through hell getting here, and they're just being subjected to more hell. If you want to break the evil practice of the people smugglers, you create additional legal routes. You make sure there are enough legal routes for asylum seekers. Asylum seeking is not criminality, it's necessity. And we just need to have a more humane attitude to the whole thing, in my view.
Thank you, William. Whilst we've been talking, I've just had an email that comes back to the story that we started this evening with, which is the discussions between the trade unions, the Scottish Government and COSLA in the context of public worker pay and the industrial action that's started in Edinburgh and is likely to begin to spread to other towns and cities across Scotland. The Deputy First Minister has said this evening, whilst the Scottish Government has no formal role in the negotiations, we continue to work collaboratively with COSLA and the trade unions and met them today for continued discussions. I welcome the commitment from all parties to continue talks to find a fair and sustainable settlement that will bring an end to the ongoing industrial action. I want to ensure an early resolution, and that will only come about if there's intense dialogue. The Scottish Government has facilitated that today. We are doing all that we can with the resources available to us in the face of the cost of living emergency and have provided an extra £140 million on a recurring basis to support a higher pay award. He finally says, all areas of the public sector are having to make challenging savings to stay within budget. The UK government has cut the Scottish Government's budget and not adjusted it for inflation, exacerbating the financial situation for both governments and councils. So my apologies, William, for changing direction there, but that's a statement we've received from John Swinney since we came on air this evening, and I thought it was worthwhile repeating it as we were still on air. But in terms of, finally, very quickly, in terms of the story we were talking about, which is the threatened return to the planned deportation of asylum seekers to the East African country of Rwanda. Uh, In more broader terms, and we've spoken about Priti Patel and Suella Braverman, is this just all about performative racism to excite readers of the Mail and Express? When I was thinking about this story today, it just screams Trump and the Mexican border to me.
Yeah, the radical right cheering at the foreigners being sold down the river. It's not edifying, and yeah, performative is what it is, in my view.
Thanks, William. Well, now we'll look at asylum seekers and the issues arising in Europe from a different perspective now, because Dutch officials are investigating the death of a baby at a vastly overcrowded centre for asylum seekers, as the medical charity Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, is deployed at the site for the first time. The infant's death is the latest incident at the Ter Apel Centre in northern Netherlands, where conditions were denounced by MSF as inhuman. Long lines of asylum seekers have formed at Ter Apel, where staff are battling to process applicants. On Wednesday, more than 700 people slept outside, reports said. Youth Care and Justice Department inspectors are probing the infant's death, which happened at a sports hall used as an emergency shelter, the Dutch Justice Department has said. The Dutch branch of Médecins Sans Frontières deployed in Ter Apel on Thursday. That's a first for the organisation that usually gives medical assistance to those in war zones. As from today, we are giving medical aid in Ter Apel, the director of Doctors Without Borders, Judith Sargentini, said. Living conditions there are inhuman and must be improved immediately. There are no showers and the toilets are dirty. We have reached a low point in our country, added the mayor of Groningen, Koen Schuling, calling on other municipalities to open their doors and help alleviate overcrowding at Ter Apel. Plans to give asylum seekers accommodation elsewhere have run into fierce resistance. Protesting residents of the small eastern town of Albergen have been chanting slogans like "No to asylum seekers" and "Go away," in response to the Dutch Refugee Agency's plans to house up to 300 asylum seekers in a local hotel. The current crisis is not the result of higher numbers of asylum seekers crossing the border into the Netherlands, but arises from a housing shortage in the Netherlands and the Dutch government scaling down its capacity to handle numbers of asylum seekers. So, William, we've been talking earlier about systems and processes being unable to cope, governments and businesses being unable to cope as economies and our societies come under pressure following the pandemic and now war in Russia and fighting and unrest across the Middle East and further afield into Africa. So is it a surprise that we're seeing symptoms such as these, a small child dying in circumstances which are as yet unexplained, and circumstances in which there is conflict between local residents and people who, after all, are seeking asylum?
Well, a child's death is a tragedy. We don't know the reasons, so it would be unwise to say too much about that because, it may be some medical condition of which the child would have died anyway. But obviously a tragedy. What was slightly more upsetting for me was to realise that actually the problem of resistance to asylum seekers is far more widespread than just the UK. I mentioned the radical right here cheering, but Dutch residents resisting the accommodation of asylum seekers in a not in my backyard sort of way doesn't bode well. There's going to be a refugee crisis in the world in the next 10 to 30 years caused by climate change. It needn't just be war, although maybe climate change will in itself foment wars. But large areas of the planet may well become uninhabitable and people are going to have to move. And we absolutely have to find a way of accommodating those people in the areas that are habitable, because the alternative does not bear thinking about. And it's depressing to see those sorts of attitudes writ large in this news story. And I don't have an answer to what makes people feel like that, but that too, like so much tonight, needs to change.
Completely, William. Thank you. Yes, the winds of change are required in all sorts of ways, not least in terms of the approaches and the responses we're seeing to those who are seeking asylum and refuge, as you say, both from the climate crisis and from persecution and from war. But let's come back to Scotland now and come back to Edinburgh, and we'll look at the media for our last item this evening, because speaking at the Edinburgh Television Festival last night, the former Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis has said that a BBC board member is an active agent of the Conservative Party who is shaping the broadcaster's news output by acting as the arbiter of BBC impartiality. Miss Maitlis highlighted the role of Sir Robbie Gibb, who previously worked as Theresa May's Director of Communications and who also helped to found the right-wing news channel GB News. Last year, he was appointed to the BBC's board by Boris Johnson and has since influenced a series of ongoing reviews of the broadcaster's editorial output. In her MacTaggart Leisure Emily Maitlis lecture, Emily Maitlis also raised concerns about the BBC's relationship with the Conservative government, saying the broadcaster went out of its way to pacify Downing Street after she criticised Dominic Cummings for his breach of the lockdown rules during the pandemic. The presenter said the corporation's bosses panicked after Ms Maitlis told Newsnight viewers in 2020 that Johnson's former aide had broken the rules, and that the country can see that, and it's shocked that the government cannot. Reflecting on her time at the BBC, Ms Maitlis said the corporation often slipped into a both-sidesism approach to impartiality that gave a platform to individuals who did not deserve airtime. She recalled how during the 2016 EU referendum, the BBC would create a false equivalence by putting one pro-Brexit economist on air to debate with one anti-Brexit economist, even though the overwhelming majority of economists felt and said that Brexit was a bad idea. Acknowledging her own mistakes while seeking to achieve impartiality, she also said attacks on the media can cause journalists to censor our own interviews to avoid the backlash. She warned that the traditional media is becoming increasingly afraid to stand up for itself in an era where facts are getting lost, constitutional norms are trashed, and claims are frequently unchallenged. She said sections of both the BBC and government-supporting newspapers appear to go into an automatic crouch position whenever Brexit looms large. Despite queues at the British border and economic issues piling up, such outlets are still reluctant to discuss the impact of Brexit, and that's in case they get labelled pessimistic, anti-populist, or worse still, as above, unpatriotic. She concluded, our job is to make sense of what we are seeing and anticipate the next move. It's the moment, in other words, the frog should be leaping out of the boiling water and phoning all its friends to warn them. But by then, we are so far along the path of passivity that we're cooked. Now, Ms Maitlis this afternoon, William, she said that things that would once have shocked us now seem commonplace. The ministerial code violated with impunity, the unlawful attempt to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. The blink and you miss it moment, the governing party's Twitter account changed its name to Fact Check UK in the middle of an election, and to quote party propaganda in a format that would sound objective, or the admission by the then Northern Ireland Secretary that he would be prepared to break international law, albeit in a limited and small way. So what do you think will the Truss or Sunak government do to beat or outdo this astonishing list of shame?
They're capable of just about anything. I think, though, the direction of travel is clear. I'm glad that Emily Maitlis has spoken up, and I'm not surprised that she's now left the BBC along with John Sopel, I believe. And I think there's a general hemorrhaging of the staff who are of any quality whatsoever. And I do regard Emily Maitlis as having been one of the best and most incisive broadcasters and interviewers they had. In Scotland, we know that the BBC has certain characteristics. In Scotland, their marching orders are to look after the established order of things, which includes protecting the Union. In England, it increasingly does appear to have been to support the Tories and not to criticise them too much. Emily Maitlis herself, of course, once famously appeared in front of a picture of Jeremy Corbyn wearing a Russian hat with a Moscow-like background. So she knows a wee bit about that. I'm sure she didn't much care for the background at the time and had very little to do with it. But I do think that control of broadcasting is something that's high on the agenda of a government which is going to have to get authoritarian in order to maintain any sort of control over the deteriorating situation. And one characteristic of it certainly is both sidesism. You see that all the time, where it's almost as if somebody who came out with a report saying that it's a bad idea to have a plank nailed to your head would have to be balanced by somebody with a plank nailed to their head. A plank bearing a plank, you might think. It's the BBC needs a lot of work. It really does. And it needs other broadcasters, such as Broadcasting Scotland, to challenge it.
Well, thank you, William. We do our little bit wherever we can, and that metaphor of planks nailed to heads is going to remain with me for a very long time. Thank you. I should say that the MacTaggart lecture, which was given by Emily Maitlis at the Edinburgh TV Festival yesterday, is available on YouTube, and it's worth a watch, believe me. But that was our final item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you. Thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. But that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and I'd also like to give very special thanks to our very special guest, William Duguid. William, thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening on Broadcasting Scotland, William. I'm reminded that on this day in 1776, it was the death of the Edinburgh-born David Hume, generally regarded as the most important philosopher ever to write in English. And at the other end, perhaps in 1819, saw the death of Greenock's James Watt, the engineer and inventor whose improvements to the steam engine were fundamental in bringing about the Industrial Revolution. I'm awa down the water to have my tea. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.